welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us at the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee's speaker series. This evening we're going to hear from Judy Margles. And before I tell you a little bit about Judy, I wanted to let you know about a few upcoming events we have because it's almost June, so it's a very busy month. So the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee has been around for a couple years now. They are a volunteer committee in the city of Wilsonville. And they have a few upcoming events. Their last speaker series for this year will be on June 26th, 6 p.m. right here. It will be Teresa Alonso Leon. She's a former state representative, and she'll be speaking as a part of Immigrant Heritage Month. June 7th, we will have a Pride event at Town Center Park. That's from 2 to 4 p.m. And then on June 19th, from 5 to 7:30 p.m. at Town Center Park, we will have our Juneteenth celebration. So those are all on the city calendar or in the Bloomsbury Messenger if you have some interest in those. Also, there's a little green card at the back. We're always seeking input on what you'd like to learn about or if there's something that we can agree about. So if you are interested in that, these are at the back of the room as well. So Judy is the Director Emerita of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for the Holocaust Education. During her 24-year tenure, she played a pivotal role in the museum's growth, transforming it from a museum without walls to a series of rented spaces. This journey accumulated at the 2014 merger with the Oregon Holocaust Resource Center and the 2017 acquisition of a permanent museum location. Before her retirement in 2023, she oversaw the expansion that included the addition of a new gallery dedicated to human rights. Prior to her work at the OJMCHE, she served as a curator at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industries for a decade, and she's the former chair of the Board of Council of American Jewish Museums and has served on the board of the American Alliance of Museums. She's also a current board member of the Cultural Advocacy Coalition of Oregon, and now consults on museum projects for various institutions across the U.S. So welcome, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you. Everybody can hear me. My mics are all working the way they should be. We will try not to screw the technology up. I'm kind of famous for it. I really appreciate this invitation. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to, I'll talk. I didn't time it. So if it's enough, just go enough already. But I'm probably going to talk maybe 45, 50 minutes and then leave lots of time for discussion if that makes sense. So if you have like a burning question and you just got to get it in now, raise your hand. If not, we'll save it for the end, okay? So what I'm doing this evening, I'm going to sort of take you through the history of Jewish immigration to Oregon because the preponderance of Jews arrived in Portland. There's a lot of Portland information here. I'm starting with a slide that I hope cracks a smile and ending with a slide that I hope cracks a smile. Towards the end of my talk, I think it's really important. This is a DEI series, and I think it's just important. I am going to talk a little bit about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in our communities. I'll touch a little bit on Israel and Hamas, but I'm not an expert, you'll hear me repeat that, and probably those aren't questions that I can really help you with. So, afterwards, if you want to chat with me, but probably I'm just not an expert. So Jewish communal life in North America. So I'm going to start the first 2 minutes of my talk. We're really going back. When did Jews first come to North America? And then we're going to get into West Coast and Oregon. So Jewish communal life in North America actually began about 370 years ago. On September 12th, 1654, we actually know the date. And there was a small boatload. This is a more contemporary painting, obviously, but there was this small boatload of Jewish refugees, and they arrived in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. This is what we now call the southern tip of Manhattan, if you've been there. I don't know if anybody, where you get the ferry, if you've been to New York City, where you get the ferry to the Statue of Liberty or to Staten Island. That's what we're talking about. The record tells us that there were 23 souls, big and little. I love that. That's what we know about those who came off. So it's led some historians to assume that most of these 13 individuals were women and children. And they had fled Recife, Brazil, after the Portuguese had taken control and reintroduced the Inquisition, right? So the Inquisition in Spain, many people fled to, many Jews and others who were kicked out fled to South America. And so in Brazil, the Portuguese came back in control in the 17th century and made it very dangerous for Jews to remain. So they came to what we call New York. They faced some legal and political resistance, most notably from the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, who referred to them as blasphemers and tried to expel them. Which was kind of odd because he was founding this colony on principles of liberty and freedom, and here he was, the Jews arrived, and he was like, oh, I want liberty and freedom, but I don't particularly want the Jews here. But he had some people in his colony, other people who said, you want to build this colony on these principles, you kind of have to let the Jews in. And there was some support from the Jewish community back in Amsterdam. And these Jews were given the right to stay. They were granted permission to, quote, travel, trade, live, and remain, so long as they did not become a burden on the colony, but were supported by their own people, which is why the Amsterdam community helped firm up their ability to stay there, because they said, okay, we'll take responsibility for them. So this group, sorry, that's kind of a blurry image, but it's just kind of showing you the arrivals. This group from Recife became the first Jewish community in North America. In 1664, after the British ousted the Dutch, the Jews of New Amsterdam were granted freedom of worship and the rights to English citizenship, of course, because we're before 1776, right? Their numbers grew slowly as more Sephardic Jews. So Sephardic Jews refers to these groups of Jews from South America who largely came from Portugal, Spain, and the Isle of Rhodes, right? So those were the areas they came from. And they all settled along the eastern seaboard. So we're really talking about 18th century arrivals. They did not come west, right? 1730, there was a new congregation. The first congregation synagogue opened on Mill Street. It was the first house of worship in North America. This is in New York City. And over the following decades, Jewish merchants established communities in colonial ports like Philadelphia, Newport, Savannah, and Charleston. By the time of the American Revolution, right, 1776, we're about to celebrate or observe the 250th founding of this country, the population of Jews was about 2,500, so still very, very small. These Sephardic Jews, they were proud, they were aristocratic, and they were culturally distinctive. They strongly supported the American Revolution. They recognized the vital importance of religious tolerance and individual liberty. And with the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791, Jews, along with other minorities, they were promised the freedom to worship and participate fully in American civic life. Another influx of Jews began arriving in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, when a great number of Jews from Central Europe, they were seeking escape from the instability, they were seeking better opportunities, and they began to immigrate to the United States. This was what we can call the first mass migration to this country, in which entire families or even large portions of communities moved from a single region or country. This is actually from the collection in the Jewish Museum. It's a rabbinic blessing. So rabbis, when people were leaving their communities, they would write out a blessing and people would carry it with them. They would keep it so that it would be with them when they arrived, and we were lucky enough to have this in the collection of the museum. Central European, this migration was not random, and it really came out of, so it wasn't that people decided that living here in the United States was going to be, it wasn't random. They were very, very decisive in moving, and it really came about because of anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe. And it began as discrimination always begins when a depression hits, right? The economy hits hard times, and other people are scapegoated. We see this time and time again. Jews were forced to pay special taxes, they were often unable to hold business licenses, and in some communities, they were prohibited from marrying. These circumstances brought a continuing stream of German and some Polish Jews to the United States until around 1880. And we can look at the population figures. Remember, 2,500 were living here in 1776. So within a 40-year period, the number of Jews rose to 15,000 in 1840, to 150,000 in 1860, to 250,000 in 1880. So this was, as I said, the first large mass migration of Jews to the country. Indeed, these newcomers arrived precisely at the time when the United States was expanding geographically, economically, and socially. And these Jews who came, they followed the country's routes of expansion. Most were men, right? The women weren't coming at this time. Mostly were men, they were young men, they'd been traders or artisans in Germany, and they became peddlers and merchants in their new home. So unlike the Sephardic Jews, that first group who came, these German immigrants, they were much more secular. They weren't afraid. They were also not afraid to move into small communities across the United States. I'll say they also came into Canada, where I'm from. My whole family, my immigration story is precisely that. These patterns of settlement replicated in many communities throughout the United States help to establish American Judaism as a national faith. So the major impetus for much of the early settlement on the West Coast, I'm sure you know, was the California Gold Rush, 1849, right? Gold, discovery of gold, as it's very clear there. Maybe some miner was Jewish. I'd love somebody to say, oh, my great-great-grandfather was a Jewish miner. We have no stories of miners who were Jewish. But the Jews certainly saw the opportunity, and what was much more likely as they worked as merchants and storekeepers in the mining towns, what has come to be called mining the miners, so taking care of the miners. It's not pejorative at all. It's really what the Jews were capable of doing. Of course, the example that possibly is familiar to you is the person who invented the denim, the jeans, to make sure the miners' clothes wouldn't fall apart. That, of course, was Levi Strauss, who came to California and met the needs of the gold rush miners. By the close of the 1850s, San Francisco, because of the gold rush, was the largest Jewish population, had the second largest Jewish population, only smaller than New York City. In San Francisco at that time, 6 to 10% of the population was Jewish. So in December 1851, this was 8 years, okay, what year did Oregon become part of the Union?
59.
Oh, yes. Anybody know the date?
February 14th.
Yes, Valentine's Day, exactly. So we're in December 1858, so this is 8 years before Oregon joined the Union. And there was news of a gold discovery 35 miles north of the California border, and news reached the miners in the Sacramento Valley. So miners came to the area in droves, and a thriving mining town developed along the gold-laden Jackson Creek. Within months, there were Swedes, Irish, Turks, Germans, and other Europeans, Chinese and Americans from all over the country were combing the hills, hoping to stake claims. And of course, Jewish men came too. Most were from San Francisco. There you've got them. Most were from San Francisco, and they became the primary suppliers for the miners. In 1851, 2 prospectors had discovered gold in Rich Creek, touching off southern Oregon's gold rush. By 1852, the town of Jacksonville counted 7 Jewish residents, all young men, all involved in storekeeping. In 1856, so just a few years later, the Jews in Jacksonville came together in the Oddfellows Hall to celebrate the first high holiday services in the Oregon Territory. High holidays are the holidays that take place in the fall, the New Year, the Jewish New Year, which is called Rosh Hashanah, and the Day of Fasting, which is called Yom Kippur. A few years later, 1864, there was a Jewish merchant who actually took the post of the city council president, effectively becoming Oregon's first Jewish mayor. By the late 50s, however, Jacksonville, this is a photo from Jacksonville, it was the most important community between Portland and San Francisco, the most important community, not just for the Jews. But as happens in these towns, prosperity was actually short-lived. The merchant economy was destroyed by, anybody know what it might have been destroyed by? Train. You got it, that railroad, you know? If the railroad doesn't come through your town, you kind of don't stand a chance in those days. The railroad actually came into Southern Oregon in 1884, but it bypassed Jacksonville. So the merchants were trying to selling goods, their prices, they were selling goods, but their prices reflected the cost of shipping by stage and steamer. They just couldn't compete with cheaper rail-shipped goods, right? It's a story that's not unfamiliar, unfortunately. So recognizing they could not make a decent living, many of these Jews returned to San Francisco. Actually, in 1936, skipping into this century, though, it was the last descendant of a pioneer Jewish family was buried in the Jacksonville Cemetery. I don't know if anybody has been to Jacksonville and has been in the cemetery. You know, it's a very old cemetery. It was established in 1859, and they had special sections for Catholics, the Masons, the Jews, and others, as well as a general city section. So the first Jewish graves belonged to pioneer peddler and merchant families who, along with other Americans and immigrants from around the world, had flocked to the mining camp in search of a fortune, or at least of a livelihood. I've actually walked through, there are 13 Jewish graves there. Most of them are children. So it's hard. It's quite hard. Certainly the demographics of Jewish immigration to this region closely follow the national norm. Oregon towns were springing up, and by the mid-19th century, Jews had made their ways into communities such as Baker. We've got some photos. That's Baker. Jacksonville, I mentioned, Salem, Heppner, Ashland, the Dalles, Silverton, Tillamook, Astoria, Eugene, Pendleton, Hillsborough, and Burns, Albany, and Corvallis. I just want to say something about Heppner. Has anyone been to Heppner? So Heppner was named after Henry Heppner, a Jew who had settled there in the 19th century. And he wasn't a politician, but he was beloved in the town. And the story I love about Henry Heppner is while he was still alive, the town voted to name the town Heppner in his honor, and there was one vote against. Yeah, he voted against it, but he lost. But throughout all these small towns, Jews threw themselves into the life of the towns, weaving their own existences intimately into the economic, social, and cultural fabric wherever they found themselves. We're not really sure who the identity of the first Jew to come to Oregon is. Probably, though, it was an itinerant peddler. Right? That's how Jews really, that's how many immigrants got their way. They were able to just gather stuff and sell it. We know who the first Jewish settlers were, though. They were Jacob and Goldsmith and Lewis May, who in 1849 arrived in Oregon, operated a general store, and that's actually a photo. They operated a general store in this area. This is a photo of Front Street in Portland. This is, we think, the oldest extant photo in Oregon. It's from 1852. If you look in the far left, if you can see the lines, that's actually a mast of a ship, right? So, and I love looking at this photo and just thinking about, you see all these men, not a woman in sight. Streets were muddy. Like, could you imagine being a woman, being a man, just living here? So that's a wonderfully evocative image. A few years later, after the Goldsmith and May came, there were brothers from Bavaria. They also opened a store on Front Avenue. Others followed, and finally, we know the first Jewish woman to arrive in Oregon appears to have been a boarding house owner who catered to these Jewish bachelors, indicating a contingent of them large enough for her to have made a living, right? So she came. Her name was Carolyn Weinshank. She came in the early 1850s. And most of the people who stayed with her were not necessarily coming directly to Oregon. They might have stopped elsewhere before coming to Portland. Maybe they came from the gold rush. Maybe they stayed only briefly. But Mrs. Weinshank had one job and only one job, and that was to make sure that these young Jewish men married within the faith, right? They did not want these young Jewish men. So her job was to sort of keep an eye on them and help them find brides both in San Francisco or actually back in Europe, right? There was a tremendous, there was more intermarriage, obviously, necessarily there was more intermarriage at this time than we can possibly document, because if a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman and then abandons the faith, we don't really know, we can't track them, but we do know you're young, you're a young boy, man, and you come to this place and you want to get settled down. So it didn't always mean that that people married within the faith. But with the largest Jewish population in Portland, these pioneers, they recognized their community would only grow if their religious needs were met. The first synagogue, Beth Israel, which is the congregation in Portland, was organized in 1858. It had its first home. This is a photo of the first home, which was at the corner, right downtown, if you know Portland, at the corner of Southwest Oak and 5th. The synagogue emerged at a time where Portland sported 16 blocks of wooden houses, the National Hotel, a post office, 5 churches, 1 school, and 55 saloons. I mentioned that it was mostly young men, right? This is a wedding invitation of between 2 young men and women, Simon Baum and Mariana Bettman, and they were one of the first, if not the first, one of the first. We haven't really identified that completely, to be married in Oregon. Simon was an early settler. Maybe he lived in Mrs. Weinshank's house. We don't actually know. Mariana came from San Francisco. The ceremony took place in Burke's Hall on First Avenue in a bare upstairs loft over a livery stable and blacksmith shop. And that's where Beth Israel held its first services. And they were married, as you can see, September 19th, 1858. But again, I showed you that picture of Front Street. I mean, imagine being a bride and getting married in a horse, upstairs in a livery. I mean, the smell is terrible. We don't have a photo of Simon and Mariana, unfortunately. But here's another photo of another German Jewish couple who had arrived, Isaac and Sarah Boskowitz. They had traveled by boat up the Columbia River and then by stagecoach to Union, where they opened a general store, and they eventually moved to La Grande and had 5 children. And I show you that photo because the German Jews were, Germany in the 19th century was very sophisticated, right? So the German Jews who came had a certain kind of, they were educated and they knew things and they dressed well. And then they come to this muddy environment. I just have so much respect for these women who settled here with their brides. And indeed, when I talk about these early years of Jewish settlement, I often talk about the freedom that these young, adventurous men must have felt to be able to start their lives anew after such hardship in Central Europe. What seems undeniable about all of these early Jewish settlers to this region is the fact that they were literally having the time of their lives, unable to fulfill their ambitions in the old country because of discrimination. They came to the United States and Oregon, and there was a level playing field. They were in Oregon, they were really coming at a time when all the settlers were coming, right? So they could be equal to other immigrant groups. They were not facing much discrimination. I'll get to that in a minute. Fitting in was important. Becoming American was even more important. And like their Christian neighbors, they believed in law and order, saving money, and building community institutions. And I don't want to romanticize, it's not like everybody was just so perfect and so committed, but they, when I think we see that, when you've been discriminated in your country, your home country, you come to another country, you naturally just want to do well. And that's what these Jews were doing. A bit later, as I mentioned at the beginning, I am going to talk about the troubling resurgence of anti-Semitism to date. But it is worth pointing out, despite the ability of these early Jewish settlers to put down roots and create community, anti-Jewish thought did exist. And one example that I'll give you is the Dunn Report. So Dun and Bradstreet, anybody familiar with the Dun and Bradstreet? So today the Dun and Bradstreet, they're credit ratings, right? It's for, right? So back in the old days, it was called the Dunn Reports. It was the first credit rating service in the country. And what you had were local correspondents. They prepared handwritten credit reports on individuals and firms. It included information about the duration of the business, the net worth, the sources of wealth, the character and reputation of the owners, their partners, their successors. But what we found, I actually read these minuscule ink. It was so hard to decipher, but we actually deciphered a pile of them. And what we found is that the reporters routinely wrote that Jewish merchants in Oregon did not comply with Protestant business ethics, and they often submitted reports replete with negative stereotypes. And I have to share two, okay? So this is Henry Rosenfeld & Co. This was a store in downtown Portland. Here's what the Dunn Report said about Henry Rosenfeld. Solomon and Henry Rosenfeld, they were brothers. When Solomon and Henry Rosenfeld arrived in Portland, they opened a cigar store at 83 Front Street. It was 1863. Henry, Henry, quote, is still addicted to playing poker and neglects his business at all times for this amusement, and by common consent, is very successful at cards. Aaron Meyer, so if anybody remembers Meyer and Frank, right? There's going to be a point where nobody's going to remember Meyer and Frank. So Meyer and Frank was one of the earliest department stores in Oregon. So here's what the Dunn Report says about Aaron Meyer. Oh, I have a photo. There's Aaron Meyer. Aaron Meyer is here 8 years. He's been in Oregon for 8 years. He's a Jew. He's hardworking and attentive, not looked upon as honest, middle-aged, of only fair business character. Right? There you go. At the time, Aaron Meyer, just to give you a little context, there were about 1,000 people living in Portland. So by the 1880s, so the German Jews, the Jews from Central Europe have settled here. 1880s, a very different Jewish experience brought changes to the region's Jewry. Waves of pogroms, the enactment of anti-Jewish laws, following the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II in 1881 in Russia. This sparked the beginning of a major Jewish exodus from Russia to the United States. The assassins encouraged mass rebellions, and the situation in Russia became anarchic and chaotic for everyone, and the Jews were blamed. Pogroms broke out, mostly consisting of looting, but also some murder, some rape. In May 1882, laws were passed blaming the Jews for the pogroms. This led to restrictions on Jewish land ownership and prohibitions on Jews from living in villages and attending secular schools. Life became utterly impossible for Jews living in the pale, what we call the Pale of Settlement. When Nicholas II took over in 1894, situation for Jews deteriorated further. In 1912, a new law passed that prohibited even the grandchildren of Jews from serving as military officers. And despite the fact that there were still large Jews and and those of Jewish heritage serving in the military. But this did lead to a mass exodus to the United States, which by the time it was curtailed in 1924, estimated 2.5 million Jews had immigrated to the United States, swelling the population to about 4 million in 1930. In Oregon, like elsewhere, the Russian Jews were undereducated, poor, oddly dressed, and religious. So there's just a photo of some Jewish immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. And if you compare them to the photo I showed of the man and the woman who had immigrated from Germany, right? You can really see the difference in their being. Indeed, compared to the assimilated German Jews who embraced adventure and entrepreneurialism, they didn't appear to ever be able to adapt. You know, they spoke this language. I don't know if any Russian speaker in the room, but the German Jews had a leg up because there were so many other immigrants into this region who spoke German. German was kind of the lingua franca on the street. Then the Russians came, and you couldn't understand them. If you've heard Russian, there's barely a word that you sort of get. German, you can sort of understand a word or two, perhaps. But of course, these immigrants came with dreams and ambitions, and after the dreaded inspections at Ellis Island, perhaps a stopover in New York's Lower East Side, some did head west to Oregon. Most of the Russian Jews settled in South Portland, where they created a familiar community. There were there were synagogues. So there's a synagogue that was built in the late 19th century of Sholem. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a bit. Another picture, a kosher grocery store. I love this because this is a partnership between a Jewish immigrant and an Italian immigrant. Halpern was the Jew, Calistro was the Italian, and somehow they had a kosher grocery and it worked. Lodges, B'nai B'rith lodges, or community centers. This was the first Jewish community center, service organizations, and they even built an orphanage. So how did Jews arrive when they first came to Oregon? I mentioned that they were peddlers, right? They started as junk peddling. Why? Peddling was easy, right? It was a starting point. It was a way to learn English and a way to save money. Young men traveled throughout the region, hawking goods, secondhand clothing, cooking tools, jewelry, notions, and scrap metal. Perhaps creating jobs for themselves was a way to overcome the forces of repression. Because there was a lot of interest in assimilating, clearly. You wanted to be part of the community, but having come from countries where you were so restricted and so tamped down because of being Jewish, it didn't mean you would come here and trust people to work for, right? So you didn't see Jews necessarily early on working for other people. Peddling was superb because they could just do it on their own, right? But it was marginal, right? How do you know what you're gonna, it was risky, but it was also sort of innovative, right? Nobody could believe that fortunes could be made this way or others would have done it too. But we know Jews collected junk simply because they had limited options for doing anything else. And then there were some of these junk peddlers who rose to great fortunes, and there were some who weren't. But if we think of the leading Jewish names in Oregon today, names that might be familiar, the Schnitzer name is probably familiar. Sam Schnitzer. There's a great quote, I do have to tell you, this great quote from Sam Schnitzer in the 1940s. So he came in 1906, and he was a peddler in Astoria. And then in 1940, he gave an interview for the Oregon Journal, and he just sort of wryly says, so I couldn't afford a horse, and I couldn't afford a cart, so I packed everything on my shoulders, and I just pedaled that way. And then there's a little pause, because it's an oral interview, and then he says, and now I can afford trains, or afford to ship things by trains, right? Which I really love. Jewish merchants also played an active role and an important role in the region's emerging economy. They moved to remote areas, as I said. They provided goods and services for farm families. And their much needed mercantile skills hastened their acceptance. It just made them, because they were wanting to fit in. And the German Jews definitely fared better than the Russian Jews. They encountered much less discrimination than this later wave that came. And as I said, mostly because they spoke German. Very few of the Russian Jews actually went to rural communities. So most of the Jews who went to the rural communities were the more easily assimilated German Jews. It wasn't always easy, right? Here we are again with some anti-Jewish thought coming in. I'm just going to read a letter sent by one peddler to the police commissioner. I beg respectfully to show that I am a duly licensed first-class hawker. That, as such hawker, I always perform my business in conformity with the requirements of the law. That the certain police officer named O'Nelson, without any provocation on my part, continually abuses me on every possible occasion, abuses my religion, and continually injures and humiliates me. That theretofore, on the 9th day of December 1908, said police officer called me a sheenie, which is really a slur. That after time, and on many occasions, said officer in the presence of customers called me Sheeny, motioned with his hands to represent, as he thought, a Jew, sneeringly called me 10 cents a dozen, 10 cents a dozen, Ike, cheap guy, and other epithets meant to humiliate me. So, you know, it wasn't perfect, right? There's going to be discrimination no matter what. Nonetheless, you know, both these immigrant groups, right, the Germans and the Russians, they were very alert to the consequences of lawlessness, really coming from the communities that they came from. They recognized the need for political and civic order, and they eagerly involved themselves in the state. Here's my favorite, because he's my height. He's 5 feet tall. His name is Bernard Goldsmith. Isn't he adorable? He's so adorable. So he had and he's just one of these quintessential immigrant stories. He left Bavaria for the United States in 1857 when he was 15. He worked briefly in New York before setting off, first for California and then arriving in Portland in 1861. On his way, he fought in the Indian Wars. He perfected some kind of cattle, the Durham cattle. I'm not a cow person, but somehow he did something with cows. He arrived here in Portland in 1861. He opened a jewelry store. And then he became the first Jewish mayor of Portland in 1869. He was also one of the first incorporators of the Oregon and California Railroad. He helped to establish the first bank on the Pacific coast. But maybe his most visionary undertaking was the building of the locks and canals at the falls on the Willamette River in Oregon City. That was in 1872. And he also talked the city council, when he was the mayor, into buying 40 acres of land. And that was what became City Park, which now we call it Washington Park, right? So that's also very visionary. Another favorite is someone named Ben Selling. And this is an entry. So Ben Selling wrote everything down. So every penny he gave away, he recorded in these logs. They're at the Jewish Museum in Portland. There are probably 10 of these little books. So he was one of Oregon's earliest philanthropists, and he seemed to just thrill at giving his money away. He loved to encourage others to do the same. But I don't know if you can read it, but here you've got a coat for a poor girl, $5. Every month he gave Ray Berry, his wife, money, but he had to write it down, right? One-legged man. He gave a one-legged man $5. The German AIDS Society, there was a little old lady. Oh, there it is. Yeah, little old lady's mother. A very good guy, right? Very good guy. Oh, I should just say, look at the date, right? Right around the time of the Depression, and he's still giving us money away. For the next story, so this is the Tualatin Country Club. Anybody golf at the Tualatin Country Club? You go to the Tualatin Country Club? So, you know, again, thinking about this sort of tension between acceptance and a little bit of anti-Jewish thought. You know, of course, discrimination persists, and it did persist in some ways for these early Jewish arrivals. So, you know, yes, they were mostly accepted, but it didn't translate necessarily into social mobility. So it was just a way that suspicion of Jews manifested itself. And one of the ways was refusal to be allowed in country clubs. And this is something that occurred across the country, right? And really to compensate, what these Jews, particularly in Portland, did, they just created their own internal philanthropic and social networks. I showed you a picture earlier of the Jewish Community Center. It was built in 1914 because Jews weren't allowed to join the clubs. They weren't allowed to join the Mac Club in Portland, for example, right? So this is a story about the Tualatin Country Club that you might know, but maybe you don't. But it was actually founded in part by a rabbi who had come to Portland in the early 1900s. His name was Rabbi Jonah Weiss, and he came from Cincinnati, and he was a golfer. All he wanted to do was golf. And when he found out that no golf club would let him play, this is what he did. He helped to build the Tualatin Country Club. I do have to read you from our oral history. From the oral histories at the Jewish Museum, a woman named Ladi Trattenberg tells this story, which I hope will make you laugh. She was sitting inside Beth Israel, which had moved by this point to a very beautiful building, which was downtown Portland at 12th and Main. So here's what she says. I still remember the rabbi trying an experiment of having services on Sundays. So they were meeting on Sunday mornings in Judaism, Sabbath services are on Saturday, right? So he wanted to get the fellows in as well as the old ladies. And I remember on Sunday, all of us came from religious school to attend the services. I don't know how it happened, but Rabbi Weiss's robes fell apart. The hook must have become unhooked or something, and here he was in his golf knickers. And of course, everyone burst out laughing, and some of the men, including my father, were in theirs too. It's such a wonderful sight, right? And we have other stories of reminiscences of people sitting in services. So whenever I think of Lottie Trachtenberg, based on other stories, I just imagine her with this beautiful bow in her hair, right? This little 6-year-old or something in this little frilly dress, or it's quite wonderful. So 1921, the flood of immigrants to the United States had slowed. I mentioned earlier that immigration really stopped in 1924, but 1921 was the Emergency Quota Act that the government passed, establishing national quotas on immigration, familiar again to us today. But in fact, it was 1924 that this was concretized in the Immigration Act, and it was really the time where large-scale immigration to this country, Jewish immigration and all immigrants, it's like a faucet just turned off. And there was really only a trickle of immigrants from the Pale of Settlement who came in between 1924 and say after the war. I do want to show you this wonderful picture. So there's that very first slide of those women, that title, those were women who had formed the National Council of Jewish Women in Portland, and they had built a settlement house called Neighborhood House. So they had built a place for immigrants, not just Jews, to come in and learn how to assimilate and become American. So this is an Americanization class where these women learning how to speak, how to read English. They were reading the newspaper. My grandmother, she would have been right in there, I have to tell you. That absolutely would have been her. So we've got the 1920s. After 1924, immigration began to dwindle. Oregon's Jewish community was composed mostly of immigrants from Central Europe, Russia, Eastern Europe, and population was about 12,000 Jews. I would be remiss, I said Bernard Goldsmith, the mayor, was my favorite, but actually I've got one better. So I have to mention, anybody know who that is? Mel Blanc, right? So I don't know if you know Mel Blanc lived here. So he came in 1908 to Oregon. He was, I think, 6 years old. And of course, he went on to Hollywood to become the voice of Bugs Bunny. But he lived in Portland, and he performed regularly at the Neighborhood House. He was on a weekly radio show, and he always said that he could, that he perfected all his voices, particularly Woody Woodpecker. He went to Lincoln High School in Portland, which is now Lincoln Hall, part of Portland State. And he always said he just perfected his voices because he would walk down the halls and the echoes. But my one story about this lovely little Jewish, he wasn't very big, this lovely little Jewish boy goes to Hollywood. His first job as a little Jewish boy was playing the role of Porky the Pig, which I think is kind of wonderful. And then, of course, for all of us, there's the issue of leisure time and vacations, right? So before the days of white settlement, how did you get to the coast? How could the Native Americans here, right? It was extremely limited. After the gold rush and the Oregon Donation Land Law of 1850, of course, you had this influx of white settlers to the Oregon Territory. New towns were springing up everywhere, providing lumber, fish, shellfish, other goods. And there were ambitious hopes to increase tourism. So you had bridges and roads constructed, railroads laid and improved. So you had the more established German families, the ones who came first, who arrived in the mid-19th century. They began to build homes in Seaview, Washington, and Gerhardt. As Jews from Eastern Europe arrived, they too found the Pacific Ocean compelling, seizing on the spirit of vacationing within a few years of arriving in Oregon. And of course, vacations really symbolize the promise of American abundance, right? They're really the culmination of the American dream to be able to take a vacation. So here's another of my favorite images. There you've got it. You've got these two. I actually got to know his grandson very, very well, the Milsteins. And you can only imagine, they'd probably not been here very long. They scraped together enough money. I think they probably stayed in a tin shed wherever, they were in Seaside, obviously. She's wearing a bathing costume. That is a bathing suit. He didn't get the memo, right? He's just sitting there in his suit. You know, they're squinting in the sun. I think they look really proud, right? And the other American dream, how do you get to the coast, right? Here you get to buy a car, right? This is taking a vacation, owning a car. I think those are real symbols of the American dream. Jews wanted to do good, right? So they did serve in the armed forces. Some who saw combat, quite naturally, didn't want to talk about it. Many glossed over their experiences. Many admitted that they were just glad to have survived. World War II veterans had no doubt that their motivations to destroy the Nazis encouraged them to join. They wanted to quell the threat of fascism from the East and the West, and that helped them to stay alive, this burning issue. Many men and women serving in Korea or Vietnam, of course, they anguished over the poverty and the impact of war. And this is actually, he's wearing a religious garb called a tallis, which is a prayer shawl that Jewish men wear on certain days of the week when they're in synagogue. So this was actually a prayer service in Korea. I just do want to just give you maybe I'll just give you one example. I'm going to read you two letters from servicemen that always make me have a lump in my throat. So here's a letter. His real name was Harry Potter. I actually knew him. I once took my 5-year-old, I had to go somewhere, I had to go visit him, and I went with my 5-year-old, and she was just like, Harry Potter? And he gave her a wizard card. It's like he knew that little kid. So we have it somewhere in my house. It's quite wonderful. So he sent this letter, Harry Potter sent this letter from Iwo Jima, February 24th, 1945. He said, "It's still the foot soldiers that win the battles and wars. We may have the Navy and Naval Air Force. They do a fine job, but it remains for the foot troops to do the actual killing and taking of ground. It was a proud Marine who planted the American flag on top of the volcano recently. Somehow, in spite of the apparent hardness in a soldier's makeup, something like that brings a lump to your throat." So talking about a lump in your throat, I always choke up. We'll see if I can read this letter without choking up, about Harold Goodman. Harold Goodman, he was a radio operator with the 83rd Infantry Division, and he regularly sent letters to his mother and father, just evoking the harrowing things that he was seeing. And in turn, they sent him the prosaic news from Portland, okay? April 22nd, 1945. All he can say is somewhere in Germany. He cannot say where he is. "I'm on the far side of the last water barrier now, closer to Berlin than ever before. If you have followed the headlines, which I'm sure you have, you know quite a bit about where I am without me saying more. I can't tell you anything else, due to censorship. As we've moved forward into Germany, we've liberated thousands of slave laborers. The roads are lined with them, mostly Frenchmen, Russians, and Poles, Yugoslavs, Belgians, Dutch, many other. And we've liberated many Allied prisoners of war, especially British and Americans. The Germans had marched them from 25 to 50 miles a day, some sick all week on one loaf of bread, a day for 12 men." And then he says, "Thank you for sending the pictures of the Rose Festival princesses. I have the first 2 now, and I'm waiting for the rest. Love, Harold," right? You just can, he's 18 years old, and you just can imagine him getting these photos, right? After the war, of course, Portland was blessed with the arrival of some survivors of the Holocaust. There weren't very many. There weren't very many who came here. But ultimately, they did come. I love this photo. This is a woman, Miriam Greenstein, and her husband. Long after her arrival, she's successful here. So how wonderful. As the 20th century wore on, Jews continued to be active in the political life of the state. They routinely assumed key local and statewide leadership roles. So since the 1860s, I lost my number, there have been 21 Jewish mayors of 14 Oregon cities and towns. Jews have served as state treasurers, governors, some of them moving on to hold positions in the federal government after serving in Oregon. other Jewish marks on the land derive from the end of the Jewish of South Portland, which is where the Russian Jews had sent. And this came in the wake of a very large urban renewal project that happened in Portland in the late 1950s, throughout the 60s, that sent a number of synagogues and the Jewish Community Center to the Wrecker's Ball in the mid-1960s, right? So that's when most people, I showed you a picture of a synagogue, Ave Sholem, I don't know if you remember it. Oh, people protested, nobody wanted had to move. This is what so-called urban renewal has done to my property not for sale nor to give away, and that's what happened. The whole area was just razed. But it's useful to point out, even though the Jews living in South Portland were forced to relocate, many of them had already moved on, right? First generation Americans, the sons and daughters of those immigrants, they were entering middle class professions and occupations, and they'd already decamped to the suburbs. That's what we do, right? We don't necessarily live right next to our parents, so that's what they were doing. As Jews, anybody know who that is? You got it, good. As Jews entered a third century in the state, there was reason for optimism about the future of Oregon Jewish life. And this is Harry Glickman. He purchased the Trailblazers in 1970, and the team did get one championship in 1977. Well, I won't go into it, but you can look online if you're interested. The story of how he bought the Trailblazers is quite magnificent. And of course, this was also a time, the third century. So, we're looking the 20th century. We're looking at a time where there'd been a significant transition in Oregon's economy from a resource base to, of course, high tech, right? And other knowledge-related industries. And Jewish migrants from other parts of the country, they were drawn by opportunities afforded by this development. And they wanted to integrate into their new home by seeking out connections in their communities. These developments really exemplify the resourcefulness of each contingent of Jewish immigrants to Oregon since their arrivals in the 19th century, and it speaks to the adaptability of Jews to changing circumstances. So just in my last few minutes, I mentioned I do want to talk about the most troubling, a very troubling and pressing issue that we're facing, which is anti-Semitism and its effect today. And I am going to just start by saying a brief word about the Israel-Hamas war because, it's there. We're reading about it. I want to acknowledge the obvious. It's a deeply complex and difficult subject. But I also want to say, and I hope you understand, I just don't have the expertise to talk very much about it. So your questions probably best not to ask me. You're welcome to try, but I just don't know. I'm just not an expert. But that said, we can't ignore this war in any serious conversation about anti-Semitism. So I'm just going to offer a few thoughts. That's what people do, right? They say, I don't know anything, but I'm going to tell you exactly how I think. Right? But, okay, October 7th, 2023, that's the day Hamas killed over 1,000 people, Israelis, kidnapped 240 others from southern Israel. And of course, we've seen an outpouring of public response, right? Rallies, campus protests, city and school proclamations, all criticizing Israel. And to be clear, and I really want to emphasize this, these events, by and large, have been peaceful, right? We're not hearing about protests that have a lot of any violence, right? And they do demonstrate, at least to me, the importance of using our voices to speak out when we believe injustice has occurred. And in coverage of discussion of these events, you've probably seen two terms, right? You've seen the term anti-Semitism, and you've probably seen the term anti-Zionism, right? And they're sometimes used interchangeably. And I think the one thing I can help perhaps is help you distinguish what they mean, right? So what is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism refers to the hostility towards Jews simply because they are Jewish. It's often rooted in harmful stereotypes, conspiracy theories, or beliefs about Jewish inferiority. What is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism is opposition to the Jewish movement for self-determination and the existence of a Jewish homeland in Israel. Anti-Zionism crosses into anti-Semitism when it adopts anti-Semitic tropes, blames all Jews for the actions of Israel, or denies Israel's right to exist. Anti-Semitism's long and painful history reminds us that we must reject the false choice between Jewish safety and Palestinian sovereignty. The answer to anti-Semitism is not Islamophobia. Human dignity is not a zero-sum game. We must care about the rights and safety of all people. And I'll close this part, this brief digression, by just quoting a rabbi. Her name is Sharon Brous. She is in LA. And I think she poignantly, in my mind, sort of helps us get to a point. She says, what I'm asking is for us to dare to hold the humanity, the heartache, and the need for the security of the Jewish people, while also holding the humanity, the dignity, and the need for justice of the Palestinian people. The only justice is justice for all. So I'm going to just move away from that for the moment. I hope that maybe answered some questions in your mind. Of course, you're welcome to ask me a question. I will endeavor to answer it as best I can if you have a question about that. But there's just no simple formula for addressing the resurgence of anti-Semitism. But let's just unpack the term a little bit more. Anti-Semitism, the term was not coined by Jews. It was invented by those who sought to justify their hostility towards Jews, and it really helps us understand why the term makes us feel uncomfortable, inadequate, whatever. It's also not one monolithic force. It appears in many forms, from subtle biases to violent extremism. It comes from across the ideological spectrum. Anti-Semitism does not even require the presence of a Jewish community to thrive. And I know it seems like a kind of a weird example, but somehow I always use this example of Japan. I don't mean to criticize Japan, but Japan has a very small Jewish population, but it has anti-Semitic narratives, and they flourish there. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, we are not talking about a problem that concerns Jews alone. As I discussed, as I've mentioned, Jews have lived in Oregon since the 1840s, long before statehood. They've been deeply woven into the civic, cultural, and political life. They've contributed to many things. But yet, Oregon, as you may know, is also home to a disproportionate, because there are a number of white nationalist groups, right? These movements are built in part on foundational anti-Semitic beliefs. Anti-Semitism is not a fringe element within white nationalism. It is central to it. I don't know if you know Eric Ward. Anybody familiar with the writings of Eric Ward? If you're interested in more about this, Eric wrote this essay in 2017 called Skin in the Game. You could just look it up on the computer and you can download a copy. But he makes this point that white nationalism, the foundation of white nationalism, is anti-Semitism. He is not a person, he's not Jewish. And even if we think of, if you recall a few years ago, the murder in the synagogue in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life, that shooter, that assassin, claimed that Jews were committing a genocide against white people. And that language is alarming, but it's utterly familiar in white nationalist circles, right? And we've seen the impact of this ideology in Oregon. Between 2022 and 2024, anti-Semitic incidents in the state rose by, are you ready, 218%, from 39 incidents to 124 incidents. I mentioned a few things that occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries. So there you've got the mayor of Portland, the mayor from the 80s, Vera Katz. She was defaced with a spray-painted swastika. It has been pointed out to me that the perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing, because you often see the swastika misrepresented. This is the Nazi swastika, so they knew. Mayor Katz had fled Nazi Germany as a young child. She had this remarkable story of escaping over the Pyrenees Mountains with her family. But what this incident really tells us is that the swastika, it's not lost its power, right? You look across Portland in the United States in recent years, We see this image again and again, an emblem of hate and aggression to those who are considered the other. It is an act of violence itself. Here you've got another one. I don't know if anybody saw this. This appeared on both sides of a pedestrian bridge spanning the interstate, right? Conspiracy theories blaming Jews for 9/11. And my favorite, this is a child in Salem. I was there. I did not take this photo. So this is a child photographed with the anti-vaccine activists at the Oregon State Capitol, and many protesters were wearing the Star of David as they were complaining about anti-vaxxers. For me, the issue is not their views on medicine or free speech, whatever. But it's their appropriation of the Jewish star. It's the iconic symbol of the Nazi genocide of European Jewry. And this misuse utterly trivializes the memory of the 6 million people murdered in the Holocaust, which during the time, of course, Jews were forced to wear that yellow star as a tool of public humiliation and also systematic identification by the Nazi regime. So, to see, I was actually lobbying in Salem. Oregon in 2019 voted in a bill mandating Holocaust and genocide education in the schools. And I was actually lobbying in Salem for this bill and saw these little children going, I'm not vaccinated. They're little, they don't know. So we're in a moment, right? It's painful, it's fluid, it's deeply unsettling. And of course, we have to remember anti-Semitism. I'm here talking to you about Jewish life, but anti-Semitism is not the only hate targeting Oregonians. Muslim, Black, Latino, Asian communities have all faced discrimination and frankly, far worse than what the Jews are seeing. But I do believe, even in times of fracture, our shared narratives can often offer a place of connection. History, I'm a historian, history has to be our meeting ground. History is full of multiple voices and interpretations. It invites nuance, reflection, dialogue, qualities we need more than ever. I do often think about the power of human potential and ability as a community, the power we have to shape history and to transform even this small piece of the world. What we're doing here in this community, in the community I live in, community history isn't just a record of what happened, right? It tells the story of how people responded to what happened, how they built institutions, supported one another, and worked for change. So I'm going to go back into the history. I'm going to end with everything's my favorite, have you noticed? But this really is my favorite. It's the story of Hannah Robeson. She was a Jewish woman who raised her family in South Portland. There she is in the early 20th century. Every Friday morning, so Friday night, is Shabbat dinner, right? So every Friday morning, Hannah Robeson would place packages of food, what a family in need might need for a Shabbat dinner, into a shopping bag. And she would go with a friend to one house after the other, all around her block, with the shopping bag filled with food, but she also carried an empty shopping bag. At each stop, she held out the bags, and the bags were there for people to do what they needed to do. If they needed something for dinner, they could just take bread, they could take meat, they could take potatoes out of the one bag. If they had something to give, they put it in the other bag, right? No one knew who was giving, no one knew who was receiving. And it's really this simple act of generosity, right? Carried out quietly each week. It says so much, right? It says so much about the Oregon spirit. Caring for one another is what community, this community, my community, it's what we've always done. It's what we must continue to do. I'll end with that slide. Thank you so much, and I welcome your questions. Sorry if I talk too long. Any questions? Yeah.
I don't have questions, but I have a few pictures I took of some grave markers in Jacksonville.
Oh, you did? Oh, wow.
Jewish cemetery.
Wow.
And
Wow.
they're pretty amusing if you want me to read them.
Sure, please do.
One is Gilda Ruth Kabani, and it says Mama Knish. A Knish is Jewish food that's really yummy. Loving sister, mother, and grandmother, fine artist and chef, the original hot dog lady, you'll relish my buns.
Oh, that's hilarious. But that's not one of the pioneer graves, right?
That is
What year is that?
born 1935, died 2019.
Yeah.
Harold Drescher, born 1912, died 2008. Mother, grandmother, we can make our time worthwhile by greeting everyone with a smile. I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, that's so sweet.
And this one I really loved. This was a contemporary one. He did a lot of good for a lot of people.
Oh, I like that.
Isn't that nice?
Mm-hmm.
And there was one more that I thought was really nice. Caregiver, historian, this is no time for tears.
Perfect.
But there were some, and one says, love big, like the sky.
Oh, I like that.
There was some just really charming
Yeah.
and unusual, I thought.
Thank you. Any questions? So, yeah.
I assume you're familiar with the work of Fred Rosenbaum, who wrote extensively about the history of the San Francisco Jewish community.
Oh, wait.
Fred Rosenbaum?
I know Fred Rosenbaum, but I guess maybe I'm not.
Yeah.
He wrote about the San
He wrote two
Francisco.
books. One of them was called Cosmopolitan.
Okay.
One was
Sorry, I'm not from it. I know the Fred Rosenbaum in Portland, but clearly a different person.
He wrote
Sorry.
that, and he also wrote a history of Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco.
Okay.
And I was kind of struck by your description of the history of the general arc of history of the Jewish community in Portland.
Mm-hmm.
And comparing that to where I'm from in Los Angeles, it sounds like some of the themes that you were talking about were very similar. For example, the creation of the Jewish country, the Tualatin Country Club, was very similar to what happened in
Absolutely.
Los Angeles. Whereas in San Francisco, because the German Jews were the aristocracy, if you will, of the city,
Exactly.
very little of that kind of anti-Semitism was reflected in San Francisco, whereas here in Portland it seems to have been,
Yep.
and also in LA for sure it was, because my dad grew up in that. So,
Oh, fascinating. Yes, I think that's true. You know, when I was working at the Jewish Museum, I often said that my North Star was the West Coast. So when we talk about the Jews of Oregon, we're not, we always think about comparatively other parts of the country, but the experiences really do mirror the West Coast. You're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right about San Francisco. It was kind of an island unto itself because, yeah, thank you. Other questions? Ask anything. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, so we also had like a speaker present on the Black exclusion laws in Oregon that existed, from the Oregon Black pioneers, and so I was wondering, as another persecuted group of Jews, I mean, was there any solidarity with Black Oregonians at the time as they were kind of trying to gain their rights in the state, or were Jews as a persecuted group just trying to get by, because historically there's lots of solidarity in the civil rights movement and the Freedom Rockets and all sorts of things. And so I was just wondering if kind of were they, the Klan, pretty much hated Jews and Blacks, and they're pretty prominent in Oregon.
Here,
So.
I hate to do this, but I'll do it. I know it's here. No, I get your question. I think there you go. There's your Klan.
Right. Yeah, was there any solidarity or advocacy for Jews who maybe were able to have more rights, for Africans?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's sort of multiple ways to answer it. The Klan was the largest Klan in the 1920s. In 1923, Oregon's Klan was the largest Klan west of the Mississippi. Right, huge. I mean, and it infiltrated all aspects of government. In Portland, the sheriff was a Klans member. The mayor had Klans connections, but the Klan here in particular really didn't go after the Jews. The Catholics were their number one target. The Black people were their second target. We don't actually have any evidence in Oregon of Jews being targeted by the Klan. But back to your question about the relationship with Black Oregonians and Jewish Oregonians, there were very few Black people, right? I mean, the Oregon Territory in the 1840s Oregon was founded, when Oregon joined the Union in 1859, it was the only state founded with exclusion at its core. So baked into the Oregon Constitution were that no Negroes were allowed to live in the state, right? So it's sort of like, who would want to come here? So there was really, yes, there were sundown laws, there were, of course, voting laws, all those things. There just wasn't a very big population until World War II, when the black population came to work in the Kaiser shipyards, and that's when the population swelled in Portland, right? But we just don't have a lot of stories. Interestingly, and not, it's not great, but there's a scholar at Willamette University, Ellen Eisenberg, who wrote a book about Japanese incarceration and Jewish response to that. And this, it's a different answer, but I think it sort of portrays how sometimes Jews were feeling here. There was given what was happening in Europe, you might imagine in the 1940s when the Japanese were incarcerated in camps that the Jews would really speak out, and they didn't. There were some, but they were largely quiet. And again, it's that tension. I mean, we're kind of all feeling that today. It's that tension between really wanting to resist and protest and feeling you're just going to get thrown in jail. So I hope that answers your question. Just not definitely by the 60s. There are many stories in the oral history, not many, but there are stories in the oral history collection at the museum of Jews here going to Selma, going to Montgomery, walking with the black population, really fighting for civil rights. But yeah.
So when you started your presentation, which I really, really enjoyed, thank you so much. It seems like the narrative started with the vote that was mostly women and children, and it are partially financed with people from Amsterdam. But did you say that the vote originated in Brazil?
I did, yes. So these were Jews who had fled the Inquisition, right? So, just imagine, you flee the Inquisition in the late 15th century or early 16th century, you come to Brazil, you make your life, and then the Inquisition, the Portuguese start to take over the Dutch, take over Brazil. So they were forced to flee, yeah. And then others came, of course. Once those 23 Jews received permission to land and start their lives, that was a signal that other Jews could start coming as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
1654. But not here, of course. Nobody came west, right? Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you so much.